I would indeed, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for that sort of wonderful summary of yesterday, but also today. Yesterday, we were thinking globally about the role of face masks and head coverings, but frankly, we didn't think that was sufficient. That was not enough for the Face Off Symposium. So in our keynote this morning, we are going intergalactic with Dr. Barbara Brownie. Dr. Brownie is a principal lecturer in visual communication at the University of Hertfordshire, and I know that you will all be very familiar with Barbara's work. I suppose I was sort of very indebted to a earlier publication of Barbara's. This was a co-authored book, Superhero Costume, Identity and Disguise in Fact and Fiction, when I was working on my book, Carnival to Catwalk. And at various points yesterday through our discussions, I was sort of mindful of Barbara's work and writing there, particularly in the keynote that started yesterday by Teresa Wingy, when we were looking at that really incongruous image of someone wearing a Superman outfit with Donald Trump's head on top. But then, you know, as we were proceeding through the day, when we sort of ended by thinking again about sort of costumes and clowns, sort of Barbara's work was sort of dancing through my mind there. Today, though, as I said, going into galactic, traveling into space, I suppose we're thinking a little bit more about Barbara's more recent book, Spaceware, Weightlessness and the Final Frontier of Fashion. So although the title of Barbara's book encourages us to defy Nietzsche and to face the abyss, we shall do so boldly, which I think is a suitable mantra for the second and, as Elizabeth has said, final day of this symposium. So Barbara, thank you so very much for joining us today to start the proceedings. And the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, well, it's always nice to hear somebody's familiar with previous work. And yeah, I am sorry to disappoint those of you that are hoping I was going to be talking about superhero costumes or unmasking or some of that previous work, but I am looking at spaceware at the moment, as Benjamin has pointed out. So today I am going to be in that field. So I am going to try and share my screen to get my presentation up. Right, can everybody see?
Yes, we can.
PowerPoint. Hang on, let me just try and play this. There you go. Is that now filling your screen?
Perfect, yes it is.
Brilliant. Okay, so I am here to talk about space helmets. Primarily the purpose of the space helmet is to protect the wearer from the dangers of open space. But I must stress this will not be a technical presentation. I'm not concerned with the technical specs of the helmet. If you're concerned with those things, then you might want to know that, just for clarification, when I speak about spacesuits, I'm broadly speaking about EVA suits that are worn outside of the spaceship, particularly in the context of spacewalks. But like Robert L. Grimes, who I'm sure some of you are familiar with, I am concerned with the interpretation of masking as a symbolic action. And from this perspective, I'll be focusing on the mask and its dramatic meanings. And I'll be looking at the space helmet as a body transforming device. Of course, there are notable contexts in which these practical functions are not applicable, most notably the fashion context, of course, of the helmet or helmets that are inspired by space helmets. And in these contexts, the helmet and visor have informed the design of headwear, as was particularly the case during the space age. And I suspect we'll see a little bit more of this more frequently throughout the time of COVID, albeit informed by a different set of protective functions. But I'm not looking at fashion items that emulate the space helmet. And I do feel a responsibility to consciously avoid doing so. And this is because there is a danger in this new commercial space age of being too distracted by designed objects that signify space travel, that look aspirational, at a time when actually we need to move away from merely signifying space travel towards a new appreciation of the realities of the new commercial space race, and the likelihood that an increasing number of people will actually need to wear real functioning spacesuits and helmets. This new environment, which is the current currently emerging commercial space race and introduction potentially of mass space travel, will provide fashion designers with a new field of fashion in which to specialize, which I have referred to in the past as spacewear, and that will have its own concerns and its own specialist expertise. And new spacewear designers won't concern themselves with the desire to dress up as astronauts or to signify space travel, but rather they'll need to design things with a fully informed understanding of the demands of the space environment. As professional astronauts they're increasingly being joined by space tourists, and we'll begin to see a demand for helmets that serve both practical and aesthetic functions. But that said, I don't mean to imply that space helmets have not previously had aesthetic functions. Indeed, they have, and I will very much be showing you that today. We can't entirely separate the practical function of the space helmet from its meaning. The space helmet is consumed in earthbound culture in ways that do rely on an understanding of its practical function, its protective function. And yet, the practical function often does inform meaning. So these two things are very much entwined. In popular culture, the function of a helmet becomes painfully obvious, particularly when it's removed or it's destroyed, and we see that quite often in science fiction. Mission to Mars, for example, we see Tim Robbins' character Woody removing his helmet and dying instantly from exposure, and those kinds of images are painful reminders of how important the helmet is in the environment of space. And this, or more broadly, all images of astronauts, the iconic image of the suited astronauts, seemingly able to withstand anything that the universe could throw at them, loses some of its potency when you see images like this one on the screen here. This was in 2003 when 6 astronauts were killed as the shuttle Columbia overheated on re-entry, and the human cost of the Columbia disaster was reported on the cover of several newspapers with this image or similar images of this empty scorched helmet with a missing visor. And that shattered visor and scattered pieces became a metaphor for the broken body, with the helmet being a brutal reminder of the vulnerability of the human body that is normally protected by the spacesuit. And the fact that really even the greatest minds in the world cannot develop a suit that protects the human body from all sorts of, or many unpredictable threats that are imposed by space travel. So here is a helmet with the wearer's body absent. And we can see from the hole where the helmet, or the way the visor should be, we can see through that that the helmet is empty. The reality is, though, that in many cases the helmet is empty or appears to be empty, or we do not see what is contained within it. We do not see the face within the helmet. That face, the identity of the wearer, is often absent because the visor is reflective, seemingly opaque, and that's the result of a very thin layer of what's normally solid gold, used to guard against the heat and the glare of the sun. So the human face of the astronaut recedes behind that mask that is provided by the solar shield of the helmet. Amanda Dupree's has spoken a little bit about this, and I do recommend her work. And she describes how our eyes cannot meet those of the astronaut. It remains a one-sided relationship of being seen without the reciprocating gaze. Thus, it is an alienating gaze. In many cases, the empty suit becomes a kind of proxy for the absent astronaut, and the visor reflects back the viewer who stares at their own face, at their own reflection, reflected back as if they see themselves occupying the spacesuit. And this is something that can be exploited in museum settings to encourage aspiration in visitors. So lunar landing exhibitions, such as the display at the NASA exhibition in the Space Center in Houston in Texas, use empty spacesuits as stand-ins for astronauts. And those reflective visors enable viewers to kind of peer into an empty helmet and see their own faces gazing back as if they are projected into the empty spacesuit. So by anonymizing the astronaut, he is de-individualized, but with a reflective visor, he can appear to become the viewer. So looking at the visor, anyone can see themselves reflected back or projected into the helmet. Thus, the astronaut's achievements become that of any man or every man, and it's a clean slate onto which our collective dreams can be projected, says Amanda Dupreez. So here, one small step or one giant leap appears to have been performed for and by the whole of mankind. And the man behind the visor is not one identifiable man, but any man or any woman. And as Dupreez writes, no particular markers identify the astronaut as male or female, queer or straight, black or white, nor as happy or sad for that matter. The astronaut seemingly abolishes all differences. And this supposedly individuated man remains undifferentiated both sexually and biologically. It's worth comparing images of Neil Armstrong on the moon, anonymized, presenting or representing all of mankind, with formal portraits of Armstrong taken back on Earth with his helmet removed. And only here on Earth, with his helmet removed, does he actually become an individual and take individual ownership of his celebrated accomplishments. While many of these face coverings, or all sorts of face coverings, not just visors, render the wearer invisible, the replacement of the face with a reflection makes the astronaut's invisibility much more complex, and in quite distinct ways. This is not least because of the confusion between subjecthood and objecthood. Stern examines the difference between the effect of the veil and the visor following Barbara Martinson. She identifies the veil as distinctly feminine and Eastern, and often a sign of female submission. By contrast, in the astronaut's visor, she sees Western masculinity, authority, and dominance. If the veils, I'm quoting, if the veil's soft folds evoke femininity and compliance, its non-reflectivity and opacity present the camera lens with a blankness and absence of form ready to be transformed into an object of Western fantasy. The astronaut's visor, by contrast, is hard, gleaming, and impenetrable, recalling the helmets of armoured soldiers. It signifies masculine authority, progress, and conquest, but the veil cannot be penetrated by the light of the camera. The reflective visor reproduces it, offering back an image of heroic masculinity which is displaced at its centre by the camera itself. And so Stern suggests that reflectivity may be regarded as one of the most interesting of the visor's qualities, in which the reflection kind of replaces the sitter's face with a reflected image of whatever the astronaut is looking at. And this may be a photographer, in which case the focus of the photograph has been displaced back onto the cameraman, because it's he who is the true subject of the image. Or at other times it may be the landscape or the spacescape or the moonscape that is reflected back in the visor instead of the astronaut's face. We see reflected back at us sometimes the world in its entirety. Sometimes we see a vast, empty, blank space. And in this way, we see what the astronaut sees. We see what may be described as a God's eye view of the Earth, representing human achievement and triumph of technology over nature. Images of space exploration provide quite frequent reminders of the insignificance of humans in the universe. We see the whole of the Earth. We see all of the whole of the globe, everywhere where humans have existed for the entire history of humanity. In 1990, Voyager 1 transmitted a kind of family portrait of Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, Jupiter, Earth and Venus. And in the image, Earth appears as this pale blue dot, a very minuscule speck in a vast cosmic arena, and that tiny dot takes up a fraction of the image, and yet it's home. The Earth is home to all the people who've ever lived. So we are significant in images, or insignificant, and images from space really are the reminder of that. And so we see that reflected in these visors. We see how vast space is in contrast to the individual who might be encased in the spacesuit. So spacesuits kind of reiterate that message about space and the awe that it inspires. And they speak of the relative invisibility of the human within that vast expanse of space. We are insignificant. We are literally invisible when we are hidden in that vast arena. So in this way, again, we are projected into the spacesuit, and in those reflections, we see what the astronaut sees. We see as if through the astronaut's eyes, and it almost becomes a little bit like mind reading. The astronaut sees the lunar landscape as we do, and we see it contained within the frame that is the helmet. So that lunar landscape or lunarscape is superimposed over the image of the astronaut's mind, almost like a cartoon depiction of a subject's thoughts. We see into their brain, we see what they see. And locating the landscape within what appears to be the frame of the astronaut's head, this image appears not to be an objective image of the lunarscape, but a subjective experience of that landscape from the perspective of the astronaut. I'm going to show you a quick clip from First Man, which I have queued up. Can everybody see YouTube?
Yes, we can see that.
Great. And this clip shows Neil Armstrong, played by Ryan Gosling, stepping onto the moon for the first time. And I'm going to speak over it, so I'll just get rid of the volume a little bit. And it's seen the camera switches from a view of Armstrong's head in the helmet to his point of view as he steps off the lander and onto the surface. We keep coming backwards and forwards between seeing him, seeing his helmet, and then seeing his point of view. And so this kind of switches backwards and forwards. And traditionally that method would intersperse shots of the landscape with shots of a character's reaction. But here, when we would expect to see Ryan Gosling's face, we instead see the reflection of the landscape stretched across his visor. So that switching back and forth, instead of a switch between point of view and the character's reflection, we actually switch between close-up and a wide view of the same scene, both of which represent the astronaut's view of the scene in two different ways. So we are very much placed within the scene. We become Neil Armstrong, and he is almost erased. So it becomes our own experience. And when we consider the helmet, not from the perspective of the observer, but from the perspective of the wearer, we need to try to look at different things. The experience of wearing a helmet is just as worthy of consideration as the experience of looking at a helmet. The helmet plays a particularly vital role in the astronaut's experience of space. It mediates it in all sorts of ways. Every aspect of interaction between astronaut and their surrounding is mediated through this very highly specialized set of materials and the shapes and equipment that's around their head, and also the rest of the suit as well. So all sensory perception and interactions are translated and filtered through the helmet and also through the suit. So the phenomenology of spacesuit wearing is shaped by all sorts of things, and particularly sound. Astronaut Chris Hadfield describes the gentle sound of the fan and the liquid cooling ventilation that kind of acts as a constant reminder that the spacesuit is working to sustain the flow of oxygen to the body. And then when the fan shuts off, it becomes very quiet, and astronauts can hear their own body sounds. They can hear their own breathing. They can hear swallowing. They can hear their pulse. And on a spacewalk, Chris Hadfield recalls that the sound of your own breathing is your constant companion. And so it's quite kind of visceral. You're frequently being reminded that you are this biological being, not just philosophically, but mechanically, you are biologically human, despite having become post-human with the donning of the suit. And this is illustrated quite nicely in Gravity. So again, I'm just going to quickly show a clip of this, which I've got also queued up. Somewhere here. And I will leave sound on this. I hope you can hear the sound coming through my laptop.
Do you copy? Houston, do you copy? Houston, this is Mission Specialist Ryan Stone. I am off structure and drifting. Do you copy? Anyone?
So those sounds that an astronaut hears when they're encased in this high-tech helmet, again, they're very visceral, and they're very kind of mechanically, biologically human. And those sounds are characterized in many ways by their closeness. So in contrast to the expanse of space. So the horizon is incredibly distant and even infinite. And you see the curvature of the Earth. It's such an amazing distance away, but everything that the astronaut hears is very, very close. Kind of generated within inches of the astronaut's body, or even from the inside of the astronaut's body. So the vast visual and distant landscape bears no relationship to the relatively minute and very close aural landscape that is contained within the helmet. And we see this depicted in a number of films in which the camera kind of appears to navigate through from this vast open space into the helmet, into this small enclosed space that is kept close to the face. The absence of external sound disassociates the astronauts from that external space in many ways. Even things that are happening relatively close, including his own actions and events that take place just outside of the suit, including astronauts that are carried out by the astronaut himself, actions that are carried out by the astronaut himself. Astronaut Piers Sellis describes the odd sensation of banging a hammer or a metal tool against something on the outside of the International Space Station, and yet hearing absolutely nothing. So that's not just a result of the helmet blocking out external sound, but of course being within the vacuum of space through which sound cannot travel. So the only sound that the astronaut hears, therefore, is broadcast or generated within the helmet. Roy Sorensen stresses that hearing silence is distinct from the inability to hear a sound. And in a helmet, in space, this is particularly true and also a little bit complex. Space is silent, and yet within the helmet, sound is heard, but it's located differently. So the astronaut does not hear silence, and yet when he sees an action that ought to generate sound, there is no sound to be heard. So it's slightly disorienting. And there is therefore this unsettling contradiction in oral and visual cues that are experienced within the helmet. It's perhaps comparable to watching a movie while listening to the sounds of the surrounding real life environment instead of the sounds of the film that you're watching. However, in this unsettlingly quiet landscape, the helmet does have the capacity for sound to travel through it. The helmet is a solid object, and as such, it can pick up vibrations when it directly comes into contact with something else. So, for example, the helmet of another astronaut, if two astronauts touch their helmets together and the vibrations can travel from one to the other, they can hold a private conversation with the sound passing from one helmet into another. And that experience again is characterized by closeness in contrast to the vastness and the distance of space. I'm going to take a slight detour now to Mars to consider some of the wearable technology that has been speculatively proposed for Martian exploration, because it's significant in our understanding of the relationship between the helmet or the spacesuit more broadly and the functions of the head that are enclosed within it. The helmet is a face covering or a head covering, and it encloses organs that are responsible for many of our senses. So sights and sounds are filtered through the helmet and its components, creating the potential for significant enhancement or adjustment of the ways that humans sense their surroundings. So it's responsible for limiting, for changing, or sometimes redirecting those senses. The helmet, on a kind of basic level, limits peripheral vision and also has the potential, although currently in fiction more so than fact, to overlay additional visual information with augmented reality. And as we've just seen, it also interferes with, in various ways, the ability of the ears to hear sounds. Many of the sounds that are generated by nearby events aren't heard directly, but rather they're muffled by the helmet and reach the ear indirectly, filtered through a sound system, with sound received through microphones and fed into the ears through a headset. So sound from multiple sources is fed through that headset, including, for example, voices of other astronauts on board a space station, as well as the voices of NASA Mission Control, located hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. And one might say, therefore, that this technology extends the ears so that they can gather information from a variety of distant locations, sometimes several locations simultaneously. As we begin to consider the needs of the first Martian explorers, we need to think about the ways in which helmet wearers will see and hear that new environment on the surface of Mars. The helmet will be the interface through which we as post-humans experience extraterrestrial environments. So they do not merely assist human habitation of other planets, they also alter and mediate the human body's functions. Tim Layton observes that in the thin Martian atmosphere, sounds do not travel through the atmosphere as readily as they do on Earth. He proposes, therefore, that in order for astronauts or Martian colonists to be able to hear the sounds of potential hazards such as rockfalls, microphones would need to be relocated. He said you'd put the ears on the boots so that the sound that travels through the ground would be detectable. Vibrations traveling through the solid ground would be picked up by microphones on the soles of the feet and fed through the ears via the headset in the helmet. And in this way, he highlights the potential for spacesuit design to reconfigure human functionality. Our sound receptors can be relocated to outside of the head, beyond the helmet, elsewhere on the body. And in that way, our helmet can be the interface through which we experience things that are far beyond our immediate surroundings, with sensory information gathered from a number of different locations, including receptors that are displaced to other parts of the body. Before I conclude, I'm going to broaden this out a little bit, since my own research is not so much about the spacesuit as it is about clothing the body for microgravity. And weightlessness is often overlooked in studies of spacesuits because it doesn't pose a threat in the way that extreme temperatures of the vacuum of space does. Weightlessness separates clothes from the body while on Earth, clothes kind of rest against the body, and they contribute to the feeling of being within Earth gravity, because they're constantly resting on our skin. They are a constant reminder of the fact that we are in this Earth gravity environment because of the fact that they rest on our bodies. But astronauts become accustomed to living without the weight of the clothes against their skin to the extent that they report physical discomfort from contact with everyday clothing after they return to Earth. And those who have experienced weightlessness describe a loss of awareness of where their body ends and where its surrounding begins. Without the sensation of pressure on the epidermis, skin stops playing the role of sensor between the interior and the exterior, or between me and what is not me, or what may be my clothes or my wider environment. And if the external limits of the body are unclear, then so too is the division between body and clothes. That sensation is compounded within a spacesuit in which the internal workings of the body are externalized. The externally worn spacesuit becomes involved in actions that normally take place inside the body and transmits data to onboard computers. So the heart rate, the breathing, all of that is externalized, and we lose track of what's happening within the body and beyond the body, blurring that divide between body and space. So in this environment, therefore, perhaps helmets are not worn by astronauts, but rather enclose them, much in the same way that a car with a tinted windscreen might enclose the driver and make their faces invisible when the sunlight reflects on the windshield. And indeed, the spacesuit is often described as a one-man spaceship. It contains most of the same functions as a fully sized spaceship, aside from the parts that launch it into space. Or we might liken the helmet to a similarly shaped fishbowl that contains fish and also water. So the helmet contains the human head and also its environment. It's perhaps wise then not to think of the space helmet as a wearable, but as a containable. It contains the head as the spacesuit contains the body, and also contains other things. It contains the oxygen that keeps the astronaut alive. It contains the sound that keeps the astronaut informed about his immediate and distant surroundings. And the helmet surrounds these things and forms a barrier between them and the vastly distant environment outside its exterior surfaces. In many ways, then, the helmet is a stand-in for the whole of our environment. It contains our physical environment, and it reflects our visual environment. So it is atmosphere and environment. It is our world, it's our experiences, it's our awe, it's our wonder, it's all that contained within a small man-made sphere. Thank you very much.
Barbara, thank you so much for that. That was a joy in terms of sort of bringing together all of those ideas. And I think interesting that as we were sort of traveling out of our atmosphere and beyond our world, in some ways the talk did so much to kind of ground a lot of the sort of ideas and themes that we were talking about yesterday, in terms of notions of de-individualization and sort of visibility and invisibility. And also, I think that idea of sort of how is the body understood and represented. One thing, I mean, I hope I should just say, obviously, if you've got questions, there are some nice points that are being raised in the chat. If you want to ask a question, as I'm sure you all will, then do raise your hand, and I will come to you in a moment. But I just sort of wondered, as you're talking, what was also sort of going through my mind is sort of helmets that are worn in a terrestrial context, in terms of, let's say, the motorbike helmet or something like that. And I'm wondering if, one, in your research, you are making sort of parallels between the sort of spacesuit and obviously the context you were talking about, and then other helmets worn sort of on Earth, and whether there are sort of parallels, or whether, as you were saying, that perhaps we invest that the spacesuit and space helmet with such significance and see it so differently that actually parallels are maybe possibly apparent, but maybe ultimately unhelpful. I just wondered if you could maybe talk to that.
I think a lot of what I've said is applicable to, say, motorbike helmets. Obviously, with the potentially reflective visor, the fact that it's also got a safety function, and possibly the fact that it tends to be seen as quite masculine
Mm.
I think the connotations obviously are very significantly different, and partly that is because the space helmet is still an exclusive object, and it is associated with not only just an elite set of people, but also a set of values about space exploration and doing things for the good of the whole of mankind and things like that. So although on a physical level, everything that I've described about reflections and things is just as applicable to motorbike helmets, all of those values that are so bound up in the space helmet create a kind of barrier between making those comparisons.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a good point. In terms of the a chat, I mean, lots of people, I think, inevitably saying that the talk was really thought-provoking and expansive. Teresa Wingy making a point about the poetic metaphors are lovely. So early in the morning, where I can still see a bit of the night sky. That's a really beautiful comment. A sort of comment and sort of statement from Emily. So if I read it out, and maybe you can to respond. So Emily writes, moving sensory capacity via clothing is interesting when considering the different sensory capacities of, for example, deaf or blind people. Arguably, some deaf people would not require microphone sensors on their feet, as they already have enhanced perception through physical vibration.
I suspect that the spacesuit would dull that other sense a bit, so you'd possibly need to reintroduce the vibration in another way to make a suit that would capture that and repeat it.
Yeah.
So record it in different ways as vibration rather than as sound. So yeah, it's surprising how often disability does come up when I'm looking at spaceware more broadly. I mean, things like obviously an astronaut doesn't stand up in the weightless environment and adopts a posture, which a neutral body posture, which is actually quite a lot like a wheelchair user. And so clothes designed for wheelchair users are cut in the same way as you need to cut clothes for somebody who's in a weightless environment. So there's all sorts of interesting kind of overlaps or knowledge from the field of design for disability that is actually applicable in the spaceware environment as well. It's quite an interesting thing to look at.
No, absolutely. Again, as I said, if people want to ask a question or raise the hand, do. I can't see it at the moment. I think one thing, again, that was, as I said, in terms of the points that you're making, there is a sort of terrestrial kind of context. And obviously, a lot of the discussions that we've had where we are right now globally are situated in the context of the pandemic. And I'm just sort of wondering, I mean, maybe this is well known, but not to me, in terms of those sort of technologies and understandings of the space helmet, is any of that being used? Is any of that being adapted in terms of addressing the sort of pandemic, or sort of technologies that are transferable? I don't know.
I mean, a space helmet would stop you from catching the virus, but I think
that's a winner.
But I'm not aware of any particular experiments that have gone on. I think it would be overkill.
Yeah,
I suspect. But obviously, helmets more broadly, and the containing of clean air that is sealed in is certainly something that obviously is looked at in a virus related context. Hazmat suits and things, I suppose, is the closest you'd get to a spacesuit.
Yeah. And I suppose also you sort of, I think, started off by making a really interesting point that in terms of the context of fashion, sort of space and the notions of the final frontier sells. But as you said, I think leads to perhaps quite a sort of distorting view of what actually the sort of spacesuit is. And it sort of got me thinking that if we think about some of the big sort of sci-fi sort of franchises, the sort of Star Wars or the Star Trek, there is in some ways the absence there, isn't there, of the space helmet. And I'm sure in some ways that obviously is a conventional or practical sense that if a character's wearing the face mask, a helmet, as you said, we don't see them. But it is interesting, and I just wonder again if your research sort of connects more broadly with sort of depictions of the space helmet or space suits in sci-fi, popular culture.
Absolutely, and particularly in relation to this the invisibility or the anonymity of the wearer of the spacesuits. Knowing that you can't actually see an astronaut's face with a real helmet, a lot of these science fiction helmets are designed in a way that's clearly for camera. So you can, they're designed to show the actor's face. So they've got much bigger visors, often lights inside that actually just wouldn't work in reality because you wouldn't be able to see anything if there's a light shining on your face. So those, screen helmets are very much about the look for screen. But there are a number of films that have made very good use of the slightly unsettling feeling that you get when you are faced with a suit and you don't know whether there's anybody in it or not. And I think Fire in the Sky is one example. If a suit is stood up, it is rigid. It looks like an occupied form. And if you can't see through the helmet, you can't know for sure whether there is somebody inside it. And so in that respect, it's slightly unsettling. It could be a little bit intimidating, and it's something that can be exploited on film, where suddenly you realize, oh, there is or there isn't somebody inside this space. It's either a void, which is frightening for another reason, or there is a creature or a villain or something hidden inside it. And then, of course, the act of unmasking becomes significant, or the revealing process. And unmasking is something I've looked at previously as a significant act, and sometimes quite a terrifying act, a horrific act, or in superhero costumes, of course, it's the worst thing that can happen to a superhero is being unmasked. And so that moment of revealing who is or who is not behind that visor, the process of unmasking, I think is a brilliant thing that happens on film and TV quite often.
Absolutely. Okay, so a few more questions coming into the chat. So an interesting kind of comment by Jackie that maybe you can talk to. And they write, I've heard psychologists talking about taking off the helmet, so an act of unmasking there, but taking off the helmet as a metaphor for facing alternative ways and fears of managing a health problem, e.g. chronic pain. Is that something you've sort of come across in your research?
I haven't come across that before. Is that a visualization technique? Imagine taking off helmet and taking off pain.
Do you want to turn on your?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, it was just a way of trying to explain to health professionals what it's like for patients with health conditions and their perceptions and fears about their problem. In this context, it was chronic pain, about what it's actually like to try a new way of managing health symptoms. I know it's not quite, this is quite so relevant to what we're talking about, but it's sort of stuck with me over the years, that sort of analogy of, and a little bit, you mentioned about COVID as well, what it's like for people to go out at the moment, take off the helmet and that sort of security, and what it's like to breathe, imagining that you can breathe without, can you breathe, is there oxygen there or isn't there, that kind of idea in space, what would happen.
It does represent security in some way, and again that's something perhaps you see in sci-fi films sometimes is that a character is safe within the helmet, but one of the ways that they test whether an alien environment is safe or not is they take off the helmet, and there's a tense moment of anticipation before we discover whether or not they can breathe in that environment. So yeah, the removal of the helmet
it's like that on the street at the moment. I just thought I'd comment.
No, thank you for that. Staying with the idea of sci-fi films and programs, a question from Helen here, and looking at the TV franchise, I think The Mandalorian. And Helen writes, The Mandalorian is an exception to the lack of helmets in sci-fi programs, but here it has martial but also chivalric associations, signifying the wearer's adherence to the code of his order. I wonder whether there are any of these associations carried over to the space helmet.
I suppose that the heroic connotations, so chivalric associations being similar to heroic connotations, and I think what happens there is a suggestion that the helmet of the spacesuit could be compared to knights' helmets and armor, which are similarly rigid structures and protective, and could be occupied by anybody. They anonymize the wearer.
Absolutely. As you were talking there about the sort of foreboding sense of the spacesuit, this rigid structure, is someone in it? Are they not? I mean, I was thinking about all the sort of horror films, sort of particularly older horror films, where you've got the suit of armor and then they're holding an axe or mace or something,
yes,
or something like that. So playing on those ideas. Moving though from chivalry to quite a different area. A question or statement here, I think, more from Veronica, thanking you for a fascinating paper. And Veronica adding that Neil Armstrong's spacesuit was made by a bra manufacturer, Playtex. Bra.
Yeah, a lot of them were. They there's several reasons for this. One is because they needed to they needed compression suits on the inside of the spacesuit. And the technology already existed within the lingerie industry. So they went over to seek expertise from people who made girdles and things like that. And so they acknowledged that there is expertise in this field of lingerie design that they wanted to use. And so they actually employed whole factories full of lingerie seamstresses, and they were of the opinion for a while that only women could do the fine needlework that was required to make airtight spacesuits. So they employed people who'd worked in the lingerie industry for a while.
Interesting. I had no idea about that. Thank you. So a couple more questions. One from Elizabeth. Wonders if you could discuss further how the helmet disjoints and relocates the senses. Is this something the astronaut has to reacclimatize to when they return to Earth?
Not in the way that they have to reacclimatize to clothes, because they are inside a spacesuit for a much shorter period of time. So if you've got an astronaut on board the International Space Station, they might be there for up to 6 months. And most of that time, they're actually inside the space station wearing ordinary clothes, routine wear, t-shirts and shorts and things. So their experience of wearing clothes, which is very distinct in a weightless environment, is the thing that they have to reacclimatize from when they get back to Earth. They tend to spend only a couple of hours inside a spacesuit. Any longer than that, and they start losing fingernails and things because it's such a horrible condition. It's so uncomfortable. So it's not something that happens yet. It may be that in the future, when people are colonizing Mars, they will spend longer periods inside a spacesuit walking across the surface, and then maybe they start to get used to hearing sounds through their feet, in the same way that if you've had roller skates on for a while, you feel like you should be sliding along the floor.
That's and interesting that you mentioned Mars. I think the last time that I saw spacesuits was the Design Museum's Moving to Mars exhibition, where they were kind of thinking about what clothing might be like on the red planet if we were to inhabit it. And I suppose linked to that idea of wearing spacesuits and practicalities, a question from Deborah. I'm curious about the weight of a standard issue space helmet and spacesuit of today on Earth. So we obviously just mentioned medieval armor, and suits of armor weighing between 30 and 50 pounds or more. I guess the question then, or the point there, what's the kind of equivalent in terms of a spacesuit?
I can't give you a figure. I'm sure a quick Google search would do it. They are obviously very heavy. In space, they are weightless. However, it's the problem is bulk rather than weight, and obviously it costs a lot of money to take a weighty object up into space. But bulk is the biggest issue, and it leads to stiffness. And we had this image of the astronaut hopping on the moon.
Yeah.
And we think that the astronaut hops because maybe of the lower gravity. Actually, that the reason they hop is nothing to do with gravity. It's because the spacesuit is so bulky and stiff that they can't walk. So the bulk is the real issue. Although I gather that is also the problem with armour. If you've ever worn armour, I've spoken to people who just say it's a real problem. And you can't get into a spacesuit on your own, partly because of that, partly because of weightlessness, partly because of the weight on Earth. If you are putting a spacesuit on Earth, it takes 3 people. If you're putting one on in space, it takes 2 people. Getting dressed and undressed in a weightless environment is a difficult thing, and it's ungraceful.
As you're talking about that, again, Emma the historian, I've sort of got images of sort of Henry VIII being sort of put into his armour and stuff like that, which isn't particularly pleasant. So let's think about that space that's more interesting. We've probably got time for another question or two, or remark, if anyone has one at all. Again, I think for me, more a remark than a question, but those sort of parallels and picking up the question we did have, that idea of how, I suppose proximity was one sort of theme that came through as a theme for me in your talk. That idea of when you're wearing a mask, you are more aware of yourself, a space helmet rather, in terms of your body sounds. That's often something that is relayed through film, isn't it? The sort of
the
desperate breathing of a kind of lost in space.
Yeah, I am particularly interested in Foley and the cloth pass. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the term. The cloth pass is the track on the foot sound, the Foley, where they do the sounds of clothes. And that's interesting in all films, not just ones set in space, but in space, of course, the sounds of the body and the sounds of the clothes are very much kind of connected to each other. The sounds of the clothes become the sound of the body. The sound of the breathing is, the sound that tells us that a character is inside a spacesuit.
Absolutely. No, I hadn't really thought about that before. That's a really interesting reflection. And then a comment here from Mary, just saying again, thank you for a brilliant talk and captivating. So thank you so much for taking us out of this world, quite literally, and giving us so much to think about. I think, very much a spur for our 3 panels today, but also, as I said, connecting so nicely with a lot of the themes that we were dealing with yesterday. So Barbara, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to me.